let's introduce the next speaker. Our next speaker is Dr. Ekefre. I want to say something. I mean, how I got this whole people, honestly, I met Ebere in Berlin, and I've already said how I met Odinti. And I searched for somebody, I looked for somebody, Mata Egenti, because I know her as a visiting lecturer at Unizik, Oka, so we met there. I contacted her, and she said, I have people. And that was how I got in touch with Dr. Aniekan, and she accepted willingly. Honestly, I'm so glad that she's here today. She's also in the field of philosophy, and also in that area we are talking about. So, Professor Dr. Aniekan is a lecturer at the Department of Philosophy, Faculty of Arts, University of Uyo. She had her bachelor's degree in philosophy from the University of Calabar, the seat of conversational philosophy. I'm not sure if she knows about this organization, or So her doctorate degree is from the University of Uyo. She's teaching there, and her PhD title, William James, Polytheism and Deities in Ibibio Belief System, an ontological examination. And today she's also going to look at Ibibio practices with respect to gender violence. And she'll be talking about dignity, bodily autonomy, which I find very, very interesting, especially when we look back at what Professor Ebere talked about deadly violations through sexual abuses of different kinds. So please, Dr. Aniekan, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're listening from. My name, you already know, Dr. Aniekan Ubong Ekefre. The title of my paper is African Ontology Gender Discriminatory, an examination of Ibibio anti-women traditional practices. This work is divided into 6 sections. I had the abstract, the introduction. I looked at the uniqueness of the Ibibio culture, and then some Ibibio anti-women traditional practices. And then I tried to answer the question, is African ontology gender discriminatory? And finally, I tried to make a case for a philosophy for African feminist ontology. This work attempts to answer the question, if there is an exclusive articulation of gender-based violence in African philosophy from an ontological point of view. Ontology, as we already know, is a branch of metaphysics alongside cosmology. It is called the first philosophy. It questions the first principle. It also concerns itself with the nature of reality of realities. While African ontology here questions and also articulates the nature of African realities, it transcends the worldview with the view of solving perennial African problems that confront our own existence. This work examine the uniqueness of the Ibibio culture. What are those intrinsic qualities of the Ibibio people? And then we also looked at those Ibibio anti-women practices, as well as the influence of African ontology on gender in order to respond to the question of whether African ontology is gender discriminatory. So you may wonder, who are the Ibibios? The Ibibios are a coastal people of southern Nigeria. They can be found mostly in Akwa Ibom State. Of course, I am an Ibibio person, and you can see splinters of them in Cross River State. You can also find them in River State. You can find them actually in every part of Nigeria, in every part of the world. But their place of habitation is known to be Akwa Ibom State in Nigeria. And they are identified by one language, which is known as the Ibibio language. Ibibio translates as short, brief, or precise. The Ibibios have some culture and social religious organizations, such as what we call the Ekpo, we have the Ekpe, we have the Ebre, we have the Nabo Eko, and so many of them. They also help to enforce law and order in the society, that's in the Ibibio belief system. The Ibibios are also very religious people. They also they are traditional religious believers, and also they believe in Christianity. That is the two most practiced religion amongst the Ibibio people. That is why Ntia 2005 said that Akwa Ibom territory is today occupied by various competing Christian denominations, including the Roman Catholic Church and also the Pentecostal Church, the spiritual and the non-spiritual, jealously, seriously, and assiduously watching each other with jaundiced eyes. But then Islam arrived at Akwa Ibom, but not with enough strength to complicate the existing situation. The Ibibios believe strongly in their traditional religious belief, and these beliefs were handed down from one generation to the other, and this is part of their heritage. They believe that these commandments, we all know, have been handed down from what we call the Abbasibum. The Abbasibum is what we call the supreme God. They also believe and worship deities, divinities, what they call them. In them, we have some of them like the Akpasimai Besipo, we have Atakwan Demoran, and so many of them. They also practice and worship the spirits of the dead and ancestors. They practice sorcery, soothsaying, visioning, and prophecy. Ritual performance is also an intrinsic part of the traditional practices in the Ibibio society. It is their communion or a way of communicating with the gods and goddesses within the Ibibio pantheons. Ibibio do not believe that the only thing that exists in matter is matter. For them, matter is just a tip of the iceberg. In fact, they said the main reality is concealed from the naked eye. And for them, this world is not amendable to physical processes of measuration and mathematical accuracy in prediction. The Ibibio understands that the margin separating this physical world and the spiritual world is very thin. And this separation is what we call a metaphysical fence, thus reinforcing their belief in the visible and the invisible realm. So now I'm going to look at some of these Ibibio anti-women practices. I call them anti-women because they are, first of all, barbaric. They are, second of all, anachronistic. They inflict pain, they inflict torture, and they constitute gender-based violence. One of the ones I'll be looking at today is what we call the Mbopo. The Mbopo is translated as fattened maiden, also known as the fattening house ritual practiced in Ibibio society. It is believed to ensure her purity and marital fortune, that's of the initiate. It embodies the collective process of confinement. Sometimes this confinement will range from 2 to 3 weeks, and sometimes 2 to 3 years, depending on the status or the wealth of her family, of the initiate's family. Another thing that is done to her is fattening. She is supposed to eat and put on so much weight because, for certain reasons, which I'll discuss later, this forceful weight gain, we already know, has extreme health implications. Another thing that is done during the Mbopo ritual is what we call the circumcision or the clitoridectomy, which of course we already know that Amnesty International has asked that laws should be, put out there to abolish this practice. But for some reason, it is still being practiced within the Ibibio belief system. And then another crude and barbaric practice is the forceful removal of the teeth to create an opening in the dentition. That is to create a false diastema. We also have the tattooing and cicatrization, which is the body scarring to create keloids on the skin for body art. And then we also have the adornments with oils, dyes, and massages. Mbopo is concerned with the physical modification of the initiate to fit the standard of African beauty. This practice is born out of the Afrocentric notion of beauty, which defines the standard of beauty to be a woman with a dark skin, fuller curves, unique hairstyle, intrinsic body art, distinctive facial features. But while some of these adornments, such as the dyes, the beads, and the hairstyle, are aesthetically pleasing to the eyes, others, such as the scarring, the circumcision, the forceful removal of teeth, still and will remain barbaric and inhuman to the initiate. Another practice here is the widow rites and ritual that is practiced within the Ibibio belief system. The widow, rather than sympathize with, are subjected to practices such as solitary confinement, defacement, disinheritance, and in very extreme case, that woman can be ostracized from the community. This, of course, will cause poverty, depression, acute pain, loss of self-esteem, and even her identity. Some of the things that constitute this right will involve that the woman is asked to wear maybe a black cloth or a white cloth all through the period of mourning. She will be asked to sit on the floor or the mat all through the period of mourning. She will also be asked to stay in the same room where they have placed the corpse of her husband for a period of time. She will equally be asked to drink water used to wash the husband's corpse, and this is injurious. This is traumatic to the victim. Now, she loses every dignity and respect in this particular state she has found herself. That is why Aniekan in 2002, he wrote that in Ibibio land, a woman is married not only to her husband, but to his lineage and the extended family. That is why after this rites and the ritual, at the end of it, she would choose a brother of her late husband to stay with. Nana Anumana 2023 said she can even bring forth children through his brother who has inherited her. At this point, the woman sees this to be a human person and has become a property that can be inherited from one generation to the other or from one person to the other. And I would also like to talk about the invocation of what we call the marital deity. I don't know if some of you have heard about it. We call it the Ekponkawo. This Ekponkawo was introduced by the ancestors of the patriarchal Ibibio society to regulate the sexuality of women who belong to one husband, but the man is free to marry many women. This deity is biased because it only checks and punishes the woman. Sometimes this punishment could range from madness or prolonged or unknown illnesses, and very extreme cases, she may die at childbirth. This paper also looked at the male child preference within the Ibibio belief system. It is said that a woman without a male child is like a chicken who stands on one leg. She is still a stranger in her husband's house until she's able to have a son. And this in turn makes women to keep trying to conceive over and over again, thereby endangering their lives with health implication. That is not just the issue. It also plants a feeling of inferiority and disdain in the girl child who faces cultural rejection. And I also looked at other practices, but I don't want to waste your time. Now to the core of the issue, which is, so is African ontology gender discriminatory? Bolaji Idowu writes that Africans share common origin with regards to race, customs, and religious practices, which in turn bring back a common Africanness. What he's saying here is that these things that are happening in the Ibibio belief system cuts across so many societies in Nigeria, in many parts of Africa, like the Ekponkawa I'm talking about. Somewhere in the Yoruba land, they call it Magu. Somewhere in Shekiri, I think they have Tesho. These are issues that cut across so many places. Now, the Africans have a dualistic conception of the universe. They believe that the universe consists of the physical and the spiritual realm. Anyanwu 1961 and Ede 1983 call it duality. This duality is different from Western dualism. Why is it different? Is because with this duality they are talking about refers to the notion of dialectics, where two things, let's say Y and X, or a man and a woman, functionally different. You know that a man is quite different from the woman, functionally different, but are essential and incomplete members of the whole, a harmonious monism. African ontology is not just dualistic, but is cyclic and regulated. Any upset is an intrusion. Francis Aitum 2013 states that being exists in gradation and hierarchy. But he also said that the hierarchical placement of being is not in the ontological order of importance, but in functional differentialism. African metaphysical reality is holistic and interrelated, giving rise to the need to ensure an ontological balance or equilibrium in the universe. He also said that the ontological facility of sex differences should not be seen in a negative way, but should be seen as nature's way of complementing an arrangement to mitigate avidity in existence. So African ontology denies absolutism, monolithism, and accepts coexistence of opposites. So are we still asking if African ontology is discriminatory? The answer can be found in the distinction between both sexes. Even African ontological conception of a human person admits that the male and female are opposites, but none of these sexes is inferior to each other. Elijah John and Ekefre 2021 states, as long as the human essence is bifurcated into male and female, the two sexes are true reflection of the divine essence. So African ontology believes in the complementary and integrative role of both sexes. African ontology promotes equality, equity, harmonious relations, and functional differences. Now, my paper is making a case for a certain kind of philosophy. I'm making a case for African feminist ontology. African ontology is not gender discriminatory in theory. However, in practice, there are some gender discriminatory practices we find. Some of them have been discussed extensively by the first, the second, and the third speaker. This paper is now calling for a wide acceptance of African feminist and ontology. There is a need for a cultural ontology, a philosophy about the true nature of the African female person. A philosophy that discusses the essentialism, the differentialism, the ontology of the sex and gender of an African woman, ontology of African woman's sexuality, misogyny in metaphysics, and so much more. This ontology is asking that essential ideologies or principles of feminism be brought to the foreburner in metaphysics. We have found various disparagements of women present in the utterances and writings of Western thinkers. Someone like Friedrich Nietzsche, 1886, says that when a woman is inclined to learning, there is usually something wrong with her sex apparatus. Shakespeare recognizes only one virtue for a woman: to be slow is, in his words, is a woman's only virtue. Schopenhauer contends that women have defective powers of reasoning and deliberation. Tertullian labeled women the gateway of the devil. John Chrysostom saw women as necessary evil, and even this man, St. Thomas Aquinas, depicts women as defective and misbegotten. And I can't forget Pope St. Gregory the Great, who commented that women are slow in understanding. Her use is of two folds: animal sex and motherhood. This anti-women writing continued till it climaxed into horrific witch hunts of the Middle Ages. There is now a need for us to tell our own story, and African feminist ontology will fix that. African feminist ontology will reject the logic that defines womanhood from the way society works. This ontology maintains that the inferiority of the female sex is not a natural principle as misconstrued, but merely a social construct aimed at justifying the injustice of gender inequality where women are disadvantaged, by 2019. This ontology also argues that all gender roles can be reconstructed and all stereotype roles, of course, can be redefined. As I said earlier, African ontology in theory is not gender discriminatory. This is due to the fact that African feminist ontology has been subsumed under the gamut of African ontology. It has been lost under the umbrella of African ontology. This has then resulted in the practical maltreatment of women in African society. It is therefore imperative for the African feminist ontology to be extrapolated from African ontology in order to have its own identity and recognition. African ontology failed to give women the much needed identity, expression, and representation. So with an African feminist ontology, it will address the peculiarity of our own Africanness and at the same time, the nature of our own kind of reality. It will give women a democratic ontological representation. African feminist ontology will synergize with African ontology to eradicate those practices that lead to gender-based violence within the African philosophy. In submission, in the words of John and Ekefre 2021, he writes that there should be a synthesis of her Africanness, ontology, and feminism, hence the birth of African ontofeminism. It is believed that years of societal prejudice erected by patriarchal barriers, sociopolitical inequality, gender-based violence, religious bigotry can be shattered. This model is more realistic and feasible. I know you may be wondering, if actually African ontology is not gender discriminated, then why another kind of philosophy? Why African feminist ontology? African feminist ontology will address the practical aspects of African ontology. African feminist ontology will deal with the exclusivity found within African ontology, while also providing inclusivity, both in theory and in practice. This will include both an academic curriculum restructuring and social reorientation. We need a curriculum in African philosophy that expresses the nature of reality of an African woman, that is not mistaken for or seen to be something else other than what it is, a non-sexist ontological representation of an African woman. This philosophy requires that all sexist pronouncements be expunged from metaphysics completely. And if it cannot be expunged, it is requesting that it is rewritten the sexist part of metaphysical history, which men, of course, have colonized for too long, with the peculiarities of African culture in mind. This can be achieved through African feminist ontology. Thank you very much.
Christine, we can't hear you. I suspect you have muted yourself. Oh, please. Thank you.
Me?
Christy, are you? Yes, we can't get you.
Yes, now you can hear me now.
Okay, yes, fine. 5 on 5.
Okay, good. So, thank you again, Dr. Aniekan, for giving us that perspective from ontology. Okay, so let's get to the questions. I have Nelson and I have Mizurike for now. So we will take the two questions and then please make your question, go straight to the point. If it's contribution, go straight to it. And then Aniekan, when you will answer, please to the point. Thank you. Nelson, please.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Aniekan, for your beautiful and thought-provoking lecture. My question is simple. On the notion of Ekpon Kawa, which is, according to you, have tried to espouse in Ibibio culture, which to my mind is synonymous to the notion of Mago in Yoruba traditional culture. I wish to ask, don't you think that this practice is done on the pretext or perhaps on the logic that women, in most cases, are naturally promiscuous, and the fact that they are given to a lot of sexual exploration, and in a bid to tame that supposed sexual explorations, these notions of Mago are placed on the women in order to curb that promiscuity? That's my first question. The second one, briefly, is what is the logic of your notion of that undergirds your proposal for African feminist ontology? On what logic is it standing? What is the founding logic that undergirds that beautiful metaphysical ontological proposition? Those are my questions. Thank you.
Should I go ahead and answer?
No, we take
Okay.
it, please.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Aniekan. That was a beautiful presentation. Most of the questions have been overtaken by the three speakers before you. But in the course of your presentation, he talked about fattening. And then my question is
about what?
Fattening in the BPO culture.
Okay.
And then my question is, how is fattening a gender-based violence? What is the relationship between fattening and gender-based violence and gender-based violence? I don't see fattening as a problem. I think it's a way of acknowledging the fact that maybe it's a way of resting the women.
Maybe you ask a question, so allow her to answer. You can't ask and answer.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. I've gotten your question.
Okay, noted. So I will have now Diana, please. Diana, ask, and then Aniekan, you will answer.
Thank you very much. My question was based on the fattening too. I wanted to ask that I usually thought that the fattening room is for maybe skinny women. If you're too skinny and when you're about to be married and they want you to look a bit robust and radiant for your marriage, that's when you're taken to the fattening room. Please, can you please explain more why the fattening thing is an issue? My second question would be basically comments that Nelson made. Women being naturally promiscuous, I think if you rephrase that women are naturally promiscuous, that's why certain rituals in the Ibibio culture are meant for them to curtail their promiscuity. I think that is very heavy. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I really appreciate this question. When we talk about Ekponkawo, the issue of Ekponkawo, first I'd like to clarify that when the ancestors of the patriarchal Ibibios brought this culture, it wasn't really for the issue there was not because of promiscuity. It was more or less to protect the bloodline, the lineage. However, why it becomes a violent, I put it under gender-based violence is because the consent of the victim or the consent of the initiated in question is usually not sought. This is usually initiated during matrimony, and the woman at the point of matrimony is not usually told that such invocation is being made. It's usually after she has gone into matrimony. So because there's that absence of consent, and because also that the punishments are very extreme, I believe that a woman needs to know what is on the table. She needs to know that these are the things that can happen if such a thing happens. The issue of consent is necessary. Awareness is also necessary. So for the fact that the woman gets to either die or run mad or experience some kind of long illness, for me, that is that's violence on that woman, because if she had the right information, she would know if she is going to go into such matrimony or not. Then the issue of fattening, you're wondering if it constitutes violence. It still comes down to the issue of consent, because these young girls are picked without their consent. They believe that they are doing what is best for them as parents, as the society, based on societal standards. And usually it's not just if you're skinny or not, or your robots. It is believed that this practice brings about matrimonial fortune, that it is also an educational boudoir where a woman learns how to care for the home. But in as much as some of these practices are okay, you get to learn, there are still some aspects of the Mpopo practices that endangers the life of the initiate. And these are some of the ones I've picked out. They are barbaric. You cannot just pull out the teeth just because you want to create a false destima. And then the other question, I don't know if I've touched on the third one. It was still on fattening. So even if you're skinny or not, it is just a process. It's like something you pass through before you get to the age of being married off. The society now feels you're ripe enough to go into matrimony or motherhood or womanhood. Was there any other question I've not touched on? Hello?
I think you've touched it, but I want to say something before I take the question from Amara and Jonathan. So one is it should be gender-based violence only on the basis that only girls, only this feminine gender, these things are done to them because they are women, because they are different gender. I think, do you do it to men or the young boys? Do they have to do something about them?
No, they do not pass through this. In fact, the opposite is the case. They do not pass through any of these practices as far as the Ibibio belief system is concerned. They don't have this practice. They are not, they are not part of it.
Okay, so in as much as it does harm to the girls, in as much as it harms them, like Professor Ademora tried to highlight, impacts on them moral injury, emotional injury, whichever injury they suffer before or after this thing is done, simply because they are girls and these are not done to any other person. I think that is where we have to focus to be able to discuss the question of gender-based violence. So I'll call on Jonathan, please, your question.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Ekefre, for your interesting talk. My question has to do with your focus on consent and as something used to defend your argument. So, where is the place of cultural practices? Where is the place for law in society, for example? Are you saying that before any law can apply to any citizen, that citizen must give their consent? If someone does something and then the law wants to apply to the person says, no, it becomes violence against me because I've not given my consent. All right? It's similar to the argument you're making. The ladies that are sent to fattening rooms are sent to fattening rooms in line with the laws of society. Okay, that's the way the people do it according to their laws. So if you say that because their consent is not sought, it becomes gender-based violence, then what happens to law? Without law, we can have a society in which to defend the rights that you're talking about. Thank you.
Okay,
yes, thank you very much.
Wait,
Okay.
let's take the next person from Amara, please.
Okay, thank you. Actually, my question is for the previous speaker. I don't know whether I should go ahead or still wait. Please, I can't hear you. Can you unmute yourself?
Sorry. Yes, you can ask, please, Amara.
Okay.
Ebere, I think Professor Ebere is your question, so you take it.
Yeah. Once again, Prof, thank you for your lecture. Having a problem with some of the concepts you referred to in your lecture, such as female genital mutilation. This is because language has been a prime tool of control through which the oppressor, defines those they oppress. And sadly enough, the oppressed in turn internalize those fabricated images as their own. Euro-American feminists, they have invented the concept of female genital mutilation in place of female circumcision. To avoid this crisis of representation, don't you think, Prof, that we need to reclaim this power of naming? Thank you.
Okay, so since I have two questions, okay, Ebere, you respond, then Aniekan, you will now respond to the first one, okay? Sorry, your audio, Professor Ebere.
Thank you for your question. The female genital mutilation that I talked about is still what it is, whether it could be another terminology, a problem of terminology, but you understand what we mean by FGM, and why we are worried about it in Africa, where in Asia and other countries where it's more prevalent. So yeah, I don't think the problem of terminology will be a problem of understanding. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, I will make a contribution to that. I think you are in the right direction. Dr. Aniekan, please.
Okay, thank you very much. You asked, where is the place of the law? I want to state on a very emphatic theme that the law, the constitution of the country supersedes the law of traditional practices or what they have laid down. So if such practice is detrimental to the society, is detrimental to even a boy child or the girl child, it is the place of the constitution, the law of Nigeria, because it overrides that one. These are just things that were put in place to maintain law and order. But where such practices is rather a disadvantage than an advantage, there's a need to look into such practices. They said if we continue in such a way, each society say, okay, this is the way we need to do things because this is our own law. Before we know it, we are going to go into a state of that it gets to a point where the whole society will go blind, an eye for an eye, because such practices, you say, okay, because a woman did this, she has to die. Those are not punishment that should be determined by traditional practices. It is a judiciary that should determine if a life of a person needs to be done away with or not. It's not the place. I believe it is not the place of traditional practices custodians to do that. So I still feel that the place of consent is very much necessary for such things to be done.
Okay, thank you. I'll just make quick comments on both questions. I think with the last question, it's about consent. It is not about whether legal or positive law takes precedence over customary practices. It's the focus mainly was how can consent be the focus in trying to define the presence of gender-based violence in this context. So, and the whole idea is that within practices, people, there is this tacit consent that when you are born into an environment, definitely you have to follow it, not because all the practices are just. Okay, so not because the practices are just in themselves, we can interrogate them, we can confront them just like we are doing, but what makes my own perspective, what makes that practice gender-based violence is not necessarily consent issue, it is rather that this is only done to women because they are done to girls because they are girls. That is one. Then to the question Amara asked, I think the word mutilation, okay, has this baggage. So I mean, today people talk about clitorectomy, okay, sometimes clitorectomy, not just physical clitorectomy, but also psychological clitorectomy or something like that. So I think the word mutilation try to hang the practice on the cross. I mean, not just the practice of the female circumcision, but also the African practice. So we can use circumcision, which is not having this negative baggage, as mutilation, because the practice itself has its own reasons, although it has harmful health effects in that sense. So I think that is where we have to maybe negotiate the concept. So